Silas Thorne hadn't spoken to another human soul in 3 months. He didn't mind. People brought noise, and noise brought trouble. Silas preferred the wind. It was honest. It didn't lie about what it was. Silas was 54 years old, with a face like a dried riverbed and hands that looked more like knotted oak than flesh. He lived in a cabin that smelled of pine pitch and old regrets, perched on a ridge that overlooked a valley no one ever visited. He had his horse, a mountain of a gelding named Blue, and a Winchester 1873 that he kept cleaner than his own dinner plate. He was out on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar into nothing when the wind changed. It carried a scent that didn't belong. Not wood smoke, not horse sweat. It was a scent of iron, blood. Silas stood up. His knees popped like dry twigs. He didn't reach for the rifle yet, but he kept his eyes on the tree line where the shadows were beginning to stretch and bleed into the grass. Then he saw her. She wasn't riding. She was stumbling, a pale figure against the darkening green of the pines. She was leading a horse that looked like it had been run until its heart was ready to burst. The animal's head was low, its breath coming in ragged, with heaves. The woman wasn't much better. Her dress was a ruin of gray cotton, torn at the hem and stained with the red dust of the lower trails. She reached the gate of his perimeter fence and stopped. She didn't call out. She didn't scream for help. She just leaned her forehead against the wood of the gate post and stayed there. Silas walked down the steps, slow, purposeful. He didn't know if there were riders behind her, and he didn't intend to be caught in the open. He stopped 10 feet from the gate. Gates latch for a reason, Silas said. His voice was a low growl, and used and rusty. The woman lifted her head. Her face was pale, save for a dark, purple bruise that bloomed across her left cheekbone. Her eyes were a piercing, startled green, the color of new moss after rain. But they were hollow. They were the eyes of someone who had already said goodbye to the world. Just one night, she whispered. Her voice was so thin it barely carried over the grass. That's all I ask. One night apiece. Then I'll go. Silas looked at the horse. The animal was done. If he turned her away, she wouldn't make it 5 miles before the wolves or the cold took her. He looked back at her. She wasn't begging. There was no desperation in her face, only a tired, heavy exhaustion. You got people coming? Silas asked. Why do you think Silas will ask that? Let's know the reason for that. Hope you're following the story? She hesitated. A flicker of fear crossed her moss-green eyes, quick as a hawk's shadow. Not yet, maybe by morning. But for tonight, I just need to be where they can't see me. Silas chewed on that for a second. He knew better. He knew that taking an astray in this country usually meant taking in their lead, too. But there was something about the way she held that gate post, like it was the only thing keeping her from floating away into the sky. The barn's got dry straw, Silas said, reaching for the latch. But you'll eat in the cabin. No fires in the barn. He opened the gate. She didn't thank him. She just nodded, led her horse through, and followed him toward the small circle of light that was his life. What Silas Thorne didn't know yet was this. That single night of peace would be the shortest he'd ever known. And the storm that was coming for this woman was one that no mountain could hide. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke. It was a small space, but Silas kept it orderly. A man alone needs order, or the madness starts to seep into the cracks. He pointed to a chair by the stove. Sit, I'll look to your animal. He spent an hour in the barn. He unsaddled her mare, a fine-boned creature that had clearly been bred for speed, not the mountains. He rubbed the horse down with a burlap sack, feeling the tremors in its legs. He gave it water and a handful of grain. When he returned to the cabin, the woman was sitting exactly where he'd left her. She hadn't taken off her shawl. She hadn't even reached for the tin cup of water he'd left on the table. She was staring at the fire in the stove like she was trying to find a way to crawl inside it. Clara, she replied. Well, Clara, there's stew. It's mostly elk and salt, but it's hot. He ladled a bowl for her and set it down. He sat across from her, eating his own in silence. That was the way of the West. You didn't ask a person's history until they were ready to tell it, and sometimes not even then. But as she reached for the spoon, The shawl slipped. Just an inch. She winced, a sharp intake of breath, and quickly pulled the fabric back up. But Silas had spent years tracking wounded animals. He knew what a flinch meant. "You're hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. "I fell," she said quickly. "Too quickly." Silas set his spoon down. "I've seen a lot of falls, Clara. Falls don't make a woman move like her bones are made of glass. And they don't make bruises the shape of a man's thumb on a cheekbone." She looked at him then. For the first time, the moss-green eyes sharpened. "You said I could stay for the night. You didn't say there was a price of admission for my secrets." Silas nodded. He respected that. "Fair enough. But if I'm going to be sitting on that porch with a Winchester tonight, I'd like to know if I'm shooting at shadows or men." "Men," she said, her voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "Men who think they own everything the light touches, including me." She went back to her stew, but her hands were shaking so hard the spoon rattled against the tin bowl. Silas watched her. He saw the way she scanned the windows every time the wind made the shutters groan. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it in the mirror after the war. "I'll fetch the liniment," Silas said. "You got a cut on that shoulder that's weeping through the cotton. If it sours, you won't make it to wherever you're headed." She started to protest, but Silas was already standing. He moved with a quiet efficiency, grabbing a clean rag and a jar of salve he'd made from bear grease and herbs. "Turn your back to the light," he commanded. She hesitated, then slowly, painfully, rotated the chair. She let the shawl drop. Silas reached out, his rough fingers carefully peeling back the torn cotton of her dress to expose a wound. He expected a gash. He expected a bullet graze. He didn't expect what he saw. His breath caught in his throat. His stomach did a slow, sickening roll. There, on the delicate skin of her shoulder, was a scar. But it wasn't from a fall. It was a brand. It was fresh, the edges red and angry, puckered in a way that spoke of unimaginable pain. It was a symbol, a bee intertwined with a coiled snake, the mark of the Blackwood Ranch. Silas knew that mark. Everyone in 3 counties knew it. Julian Blackwood didn't just run cattle. He ran people. He believed that everything he touched belonged to him. If you worked for him, you were his. If you lived on his land, you were his. And if you were a woman who caught his eye, Silas pulled his hand away as if the skin were hot. "He branded you," Silas whispered, "like a yearling." Clara didn't cry. She didn't even shiver. She just stared at the wall. "He said he wanted to make sure that wherever I went, people would know who to return the property to." Silas felt a heat rising in his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. It was a cold, hard anger, the kind that had been buried for a long time. "He's coming for you," Silas said. "Yes," Clara replied. "He'll be here by sunrise. That's why I only asked for one night. I just wanted to sleep in a bed where I wasn't his property, just for a few hours, before it starts again." Silas looked at the brand. Then he looked at his Winchester leaning against the door. "Before we find out what happens when the Blackwood riders reach the ridge, take a moment. If this story is staying with you, if you can feel the Wyoming wind, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these tales of the Old West riding. And while you're here, pour yourself a fresh cup of coffee or tea. Tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are and where are you listening from? I read every single one. Now, let's head back to the cabin. The night was long. Silas didn't sleep. He made Clara take his bed, and though she protested, the exhaustion eventually claimed her. He sat in a rocking chair by the door, the Winchester across his knees. He thought about his own life. He thought about why he was up here, alone, hiding from a world that had taken too much from him. He had lost a wife to the fever and a son to a war that made no sense. He had decided that he was done with other people's problems. But then he looked at the closed door of the bedroom. He thought about that brand. A man can walk away from a lot of things. He can walk away from his home, his name, and his past. But no man worth the salt in his blood can walk away from a woman with a snake branded into her shoulder. Around 3 a.m, the wind died down. In the West, that's when you start listening. When the wind stops, the world opens up. Silas heard it first. A rhythmic thud. Soft at first, like a heartbeat. Then clearer. Multiple horses. Moving fast. They weren't trying to be quiet. Julian Blackwood didn't think he needed to be quiet on his own mountain. Silas stood up. He walked to the bedroom door and tapped softly. It opened instantly. Clara was standing there, fully dressed, her eyes wide. She'd heard it too. Go to the cellar, Silas said. There's a trapdoor under the rug. It's small and it smells like potatoes, but it's lined with stone. If they start shooting, you stay low. Silas, she said, reaching out to touch his arm. You don't have to do this. You can just tell them I moved on. They might believe you. Silas looked at her. He reached up and touched his own face, the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a bayonet in '64. I've spent 12 years telling myself, I don't owe the world nothing, Clara. I was wrong. I owe myself the right to look in the mirror tomorrow morning. He helped her into the cellar and slid the rug back into place. Then he stepped out onto the porch. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. Down the trail, 3 riders emerged from the shadows. They pulled up at the gate, their horses dancing in the cold air. The man in the middle was wearing a coat made of wolf fur. He had a hat pushed back on a head of slick, black hair. That would be Vance, Blackwood's foreman, a man who enjoyed the branding iron a little too much. Old man, Vance shouted, you're up late. Coyotes are active tonight, Silas called back. He didn't raise a rifle, but he didn't hide it either. Always keep an eye on the trash. Vance laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. We're looking for a stray. Green dress. Pretty face. She belongs to the boss. Nothing on this ridge belongs to anyone but me, Silas said. And the mountain... Don't be a fool, old-timer, Vance said, his hand drifting toward the holster at his hip. We followed the tracks. We know she's in there. Just step aside, let us take what's ours, and you can go back to your whittling. I told you, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. It was the sound of a landslide starting. Nothing here belongs to you. Now, you got 10 seconds to turn those horses around before the coyotes have something new to chew on. The 2 riders flanking Vance shifted in their saddles. They were looking at the Winchester. They were looking at the way Silas stood, perfectly still, like the stone of the ridge itself. 3-1, old man, Vance sneered. I only need 3 bullets, Silas replied. And I got 15 in the loop. You do the math. For a long heartbeat, the only sound was the creak of saddle leather. Then Vance smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Have it your way. But the boss doesn't like losing property, and he likes people who steal it even less. Vance didn't draw. Not yet. He knew he was outmatched in a stand-up fight with a man already holding a rifle. He turned his horse. We'll be back, Silas Thorne, and we won't be coming to talk next time. They rode off into the dark. Silas didn't move. He stayed on that porch until the sun began to bleed orange over the peaks. Clara came out of the cellar when the coffee was brewing. She looked at Silas, who was sitting at the table, cleaning the Winchester for the 2nd time. They'll come back with more men, she said. I know, Silas replied. I should go. If I leave now, maybe they'll follow me and leave you be. Silas looked up. He looked at the bruise on her face. He thought about the brand. You got anywhere to go, Clara? She looked at her hands. Nowhere. Just away. Away ain't a place. It's a direction. And you can't outrun Julian Blackwood in a straight line. He stood up and walked to the window. I got a friend, a man I served with. He's a marshal over in Laramie. It's a 4-day ride if we take the high passes where their horses can't follow. He's the only law in this territory that isn't in Blackwood's pocket. Clara looked at him, her eyes filling with something that looked suspiciously like hope. I'm an old man, Clara. I was getting bored with the silence anyway. They left an hour later. Silas packed light, biscuits, salt pork, ammunition. He left his cabin door unlocked. In his mind, he'd already said goodbye to it. He knew that if they made it to Laramie, he wouldn't be coming back here. Not to this life. The ride was brutal. They stayed off the trails, picking their way through boulder fields and across icy streams that numbed the horses' legs. Every time they reached a high point, Silas would scan the valley behind them. On the second day, he saw the dust clouds. 5 riders. Maybe 6. "They're gaining," Clara whispered, her face pale with cold and fear. "Let 'em gain," Silas said. "The pass at Devil's Throat is coming up. It narrows down to a path no wider than a kitchen table. They can only come at us one at a time there. But the mountains have a way of changing plans." That night, a late spring blizzard screamed down from the peaks. The air turned into a wall of white. They had to hole up in a shallow cave, huddling together for warmth. Silas wrapped his heavy wool coat around Clara, sitting at the mouth of the cave with his rifle under his poncho to keep the powder dry. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked. Her voice was muffled by the wool. "You don't even know me." Silas stared into the white dark. "I had a sister once, back in Tennessee. During the war, some men, they did things, branded her heart, if not her skin. I was too young to stop, Em. I spent 30 years trying to forget the sound of her crying." He looked at her. "I don't hear her crying anymore, Clara, not since you showed up at my gate." The snow stopped by dawn, leaving a world that was blindingly white and deathly quiet. They pushed on toward Devil's Throat. They reached the Narrows just as the sun was hitting the zenith. The path was a ledge, with a 500-foot drop on one side and a wall of granite on the other. "Go," Silas said, slapping Clara's horse on the flank. "Follow the trail for 2 miles. You'll see a cabin with a red chimney. That's the line shack. Wait for me there." She went. Silas dismounted Blue and led him into a notch in the rock where the horse would be shielded. Then he took his position behind a waist-high boulder. 10 minutes later, the first rider appeared. It was Vance. He stopped his horse 50 yards away. He saw Silas. He saw the Winchester. "This is the end of the line, Thorne." Vance shouted, "Give her up, and I'll tell Blackwood you fought brave. Maybe he'll only take a finger." Silas didn't answer with words. He adjusted his sights. "I told you," Silas whispered to the wind. "I only need 3 bullets." Vance pulled his revolver and fired, the shot echoing like a cannon in the narrow pass. The lead chipped the rock above Silas's head. Silas squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked. Vance went backward out his saddle, his fur coat fluttering like a broken bird. He didn't scream. He just vanished over the edge of the ledge. The other riders panicked. They tried to turn their horses on the narrow path, a recipe for disaster. One horse lost its footing, screaming as it slid into the abyss. Silas fired again, and again. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the rock at their feet, the ricochets singing off the granite. The remaining 3 riders had seen enough. They realized that Blackwood's money wasn't worth a trip to the bottom of the throat. They turned, spurred their horses, and fled back toward the valley. Silence returned to the pass. Silas stood up. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his hands were steady. He walked over to where Vance had fallen. He found the man's hat resting on the edge. He picked it up and tossed it into the wind. Silas reached the line shack 2 hours later. Clara was standing in the doorway, a pistol in her hand, the one Silas had given her. When she saw Blue rounding the bend, the pistol dropped to her side. She ran to him. She didn't say anything. She just buried her face in his dusty vest. "It's over, Clara," Silas said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "The snake's been cut at the head." They made it to Laramie 2 days later. The marshal was a good man, just as Silas remembered. He took Clara's statement. He looked at the brand on her shoulder with a grimace of pure fury. He sent a posse of 20 federal deputies back toward the Blackwood Ranch. Julian Blackwood's reign ended not with a brand, but with a gavel and a rope. As for Silas and Clara, they didn't go back to the ridge. Silas sold his land to a young family. He bought a small place outside of town, with enough room for a garden and a porch that didn't feel so lonely. One evening, a year later, Silas was sitting on that porch. He was still whittling. Clara came out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat beside him. She was wearing a dress of soft green, and the bruise on her face was long gone. She reached up and adjusted her shawl, but she didn't hide her shoulder anymore. The scar was still there, but it was fading. It didn't look like a brand anymore. It looked like a map of where she'd been, and the man who had helped her find her way back. You thinking about the mountain? She asked. Silas looked at the horizon, where the Wyoming peaks were turning purple in the twilight. No, he said, taking the coffee. I'm thinking about the garden. The moss is coming in thick, just like your eyes. She smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reaches all the way to heart. Because out here in the West, stories don't always end in gunfire. Sometimes they end in the quiet. And sometimes, just one night is enough to change a life forever. If this story moved you, if you believe that every scar tells a story worth hearing, then tap that like button. Leave a comment and tell us. Would you have opened the gate for Clara? Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the Wild West. Because out here, the dust never settles on a good man's soul. We'll see you on the next trail.